Madam President, August inflation numbers came out this week, and they weren't good. Inflation was even higher than expected. It was very clear that soaring prices are likely to continue for quite a while. But as usual, it doesn't seem to concern Democrats one bit. The President was asked Tuesday if he was concerned about August's even worse than expected inflation report. His answer? No, I'm not. It was just one more tone-deaf moment for the President and the Democrats. On Tuesday, the President and Democrats gathered at the White House to congratulate themselves for having passed their so-called Inflation Reduction Act, a bill that will do nothing to reduce inflation. And that's not just my opinion, Madam President. That was the conclusion of the nonpartisan Penn-Wharton budget model, and of the Democrat chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, who referred to the bill as the so-called Inflation Reduction Act on the Senate floor, while admitting it would do nothing to solve our nation's inflation crisis. But that didn't stop the Democrats from celebrating yesterday. For most of us, of course, it's difficult to understand what there was to celebrate. Leaving aside the issue of the 40-year high inflation, we already know that the bill will also fall short in another respect, on deficit reduction. Democrats' claims that the bill would provide meaningful deficit reduction were always somewhat dubious, but even granting Democrats' rosiest assumptions, President Biden wiped out any deficit reduction when he announced his massive student loan giveaway 8 days after the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law. So no inflation reduction, no deficit reduction. Oh, one other thing. And the Inflation Reduction Act will drive up energy bills for Americans. So the question is, what was there to celebrate? Well, for Democrats, the Inflation Reduction Act marked a chance to finally push through some of their far-left Green New Deal fantasies. Things like electric vehicle tax credits to help wealthy Americans buy electric cars. More than $60 billion for environmental justice priorities, including $1.9 billion for things like identifying gaps in tree canopy coverage. And the list goes on. So I think Democrats are pretty satisfied with themselves over finally jamming through elements of their Green New Deal agenda. And then, of course, they succeeded in extending increased Obamacare subsidies that will push Americans off of private health care plans and into government-run care. And then there are the tax hikes. Now, Madam President, the current Democrat leader once said, and I quote, "You don't want to take money out of the economy when the economy is shrinking," end quote, like it has in the previous 2 quarters. But those days are gone. For Democrats, raising taxes has become an article of faith. And it goes far beyond raising money to help pay for their big government spending. Democrats believe raising taxes on corporations and well-off Americans is a good in and of itself, even if those tax hikes have a negative effect on less well-off Americans and the economy. And the tax hikes that Democrats have included in their so-called Inflation Reduction Act will indeed have a negative effect on our economy and on the hardworking Americans who help support it. Democrats' tax hikes on businesses will result in slower growth, lower wages, and thousands of fewer jobs. And Democrats' tax hikes on conventional energy will result in higher energy prices for working families. Madam President, in addition to raising taxes, the other main way the Inflation Reduction Act raises revenue is by increasing IRS audits and placing new burdens on taxpayers. The Democrats' bill contains a whopping $80 billion increased funding for the IRS. That's the increase in funding, which represents 6 times the annual budget of the IRS today. More than half of those funds, or $46 billion, are earmarked for increased IRS enforcement. Just 4% is for improving customer service, which should tell you all you need to know about where Democrats' real priorities lie. The bill would provide for the hiring of as many as 87,000 new employees, which would more than double the current size of the agency, and make the IRS, if you can believe this, larger than Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Coast Guard put together, combined. Madam President, in the lead-up to passage of the Democrats' bill, the Biden administration put out a statement declaring that the money for IRS enforcement would not go to increased audits of households making less than $400,000. Because we had reason to doubt that was the case, Republicans put forward an amendment to the bill to prevent the IRS from using its new money to audit those Americans. Every Democrat, every single Democrat, voted against the amendment. So I guess Democrats are happy to oppose more IRS audits of middle-class Americans in theory, but they don't want to cut off the possibility of those audits in practice if they end up needing them to help fund their Green New Deal spending. Madam President, I don't need to tell anyone that the IRS is notorious for mishandling sensitive taxpayer data. As recently as this month, we learned that the IRS had inadvertently posted confidential taxpayer data for around 120,000 individuals on its website. Private taxpayer information that was available to the general public. And then, of course, there was last year's leak or hack of confidential taxpayer information that was shared with the left-leaning ProPublica and used to advance a partisan agenda for which, I might add, neither the IRS nor the Biden administration has provided any accountability. Then there was the infamous targeting of conservative groups for extra scrutiny under the Obama IRS. And the list goes on. And I haven't even discussed the IRS record of grossly underperforming, some would say non-existent, customer service. During the 2022 tax season, just 10% of taxpayer calls, 10% of taxpayer calls to the IRS were answered by an IRS employee. What we need to be doing is holding the IRS accountable, not sending tens of thousands of new IRS agents and turning them loose on taxpayer accounts. Earlier this week, I joined my Republican colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee to introduce legislation to prevent the IRS from using its new funding to audit American workers or small business owners earning less than $400,000 per year. I also introduced a bill this week, along with Senator Collins, to improve taxpayer service at the IRS. Our legislation, called the Increase Reliable Services Now Act, would prevent the IRS from hiring new employees for enforcement until customer service at the IRS has reached a more acceptable level. It is unacceptable that taxpayers have a 1 in 10 chance of receiving assistance when calling the IRS. And the agency should not be allowed to increase enforcement hires until it has achieved at least a basic level of customer service. So 87,000 new employees, double the size of the current IRS workforce, $80 billion, 6 times the current annual budget of the IRS, with a specific focus on going after taxpayers in this country to try and raise, whatever, more revenue to fund the Democrats' big government fantasies. At the same time, 1 in 10 taxpayers is getting their calls returned at the IRS. Madam President, I'll continue to work to increase IRS accountability and prevent hard-working Americans from being squeezed to fund Democrats' Green New Deal spending. Madam President, like the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, the spending spree that came before it, which I would add helped plunge our country into our current inflation crisis, the Inflation Reduction Act is a bad deal for the American people. And all of the self-congratulatory White House parties in the world aren't going to change that basic fundamental fact. Americans are experiencing serious economic hardship, and Democrats are doing nothing to help. Mr. President, I yield the floor.